Hello, today I'm going to demonstrate the auto-classification module for HPE Records Manager. Auto-classification is a method by which records can be moved to the appropriate place in the classification structure with a minimum of human interaction. Let's take a look. So here I have a very simple classification structure in my Records Manager dataset. This classification structure is built around movie genres. I find movies are an excellent generic example of auto-classification. It's very easy for people to understand that a particular movie will fall into a particular group. I often find when I'm explaining this, if I use industry-specific classifications, then it tends to confuse people who aren't part of that industry. So I have my classification structure here. I also have a to-be-classified holding area. This is a special type of classification that exists when you're using the auto-classification module. Any record that is placed into this to-be-classified classification area will be identified by the auto-classification process, picked up and moved to the appropriate place. Over here, I have a selection of records. Each of these records has an electronic document attached to it that holds the description of a particular movie. So what I'm going to do is move all of these records into the to-be-classified classification area so that the auto-classification process will pick them up and show you what happens. If we now jump back to our classification structure and refresh it, we should see that these records have all been moved into different parts of the classification structure. And if we expand out some of these folders, we can see that the process has done a very good job of identifying which movies are horror movies, which movies are science fiction movies. And there's also no more records remaining under the to-be-classified area. So let's jump into what's happening here in a bit more depth. On each of these classifications, there exists a new tab called Auto Classification. This tab contains the properties around how you wish this particular classification to behave in the auto classification process. You have three options. You can indicate that a classification is not suitable for auto classification, in which case the process will never automatically move a record into that classification. You can say that this particular classification is a holding area for records that are waiting to be auto classified, like the to be classified term that I have. Or you can say, make this classification available for selection by auto classification. So each of the genres that I have listed in my classification structure are set to that third option. Once a classification has been selected to be used for the auto classification process, it needs to be trained. Training is where you take a group of documents, or the classification notes, and you pass them to idle. Idle then analyzes all of that content and determines which words most uniquely represent that classification. These words, these training terms, are then associated with that category. Later on, when the auto-classification process comes along and finds a document to be classified, it passes that document to idle and asks idle to suggest the best classification that that document matches. Idle looks through all of this training information, determines which classification best suits that document, and moves it as you need to. Each classification term can also be configured to automatically create folders as records are moved under there. The options around creating folders are to create a new folder based on a time period, so each month, each week, create a folder for each owner of the record, or create a folder based on the value of an additional field on that record. So this allows you greater control around how this information is structured underneath your classification structure when the processor works. To help you better understand how classification training works, I'm going to show you an example where the process does not work as well as it could. I have a record here, another movie for Lord of the Rings. Now this movie doesn't neatly fit into one of our existing classifications. So what will happen when we auto-classify this? Once again, we assign it to the to-be-classified holding bay, and then we wait a few moments while the auto-classification process comes along, picks up the record, and attempts to move it to where it thinks is the best location. To help with the whole classification process, there's a system option that allows you to record the auto-classification's process around a particular record. So basically, what it was thinking when it moved that record to where it needs to be. This information can be appended to the notes and is really valuable when you're first setting up the auto classification and trying to get the process all humming along nicely. So if we take a look at the notes of this record now, we can see that the auto classification process picked up this record, and it guessed that it should be classified under thriller. Now clearly that's not the right classification for this particular movie, and the auto classification process itself was not particularly sure about it either. You can see here we have a confidence level of only 54. We can also see which terms in the document that's attached to the record the auto classification process used to make this decision. And as you can see here, it's identified a whole lot of words that aren't particularly relevant to what makes this movie something unique. Now, you can see here I've added a new classification term for fantasy movies. On this classification term, I configured the auto classification settings to be similar to the other classifications, and on the notes, I gave a brief description about what sorts of qualities a fantasy movie would have. Once I've created this term, I need to then index it into idle so that it can be trained and available for the auto classification process. Training a classification for auto classification is very similar to indexing a record into idle. On the administration tab in the indexes group, I have a categories button. This will bring up a dialog that allows me to select any or all of the categories of the classifications that I wish to train. On the options tab, I can decide if I want to use existing records in that classification structure for the training, or if I want to use the classification notes. In this particular case, there's no records underneath this classification structure, so I definitely want to use the notes. And then I hit the OK button. The process goes off, takes all of the information that I've given it, so either the records that are underneath that classification or the notes, passes that to idle, and trains a new category based on those terms. So this new category now exists for our auto classification process. So if I go back to our record from before, our Lord of the Rings record, and I once again move that into the to be classified holding area, and then we wait a few moments, we'll see that a new set of notes will get added telling us where it's been moved. And there you can see it successfully moved it into the fantasy genre. If we have a look under the classification structure, we now have a folder there which contains the Lord of the Rings movie that's been taken and put into the correct place. When you're training classifications, you can fine-tune the details of which terms that this classification is going to hit by manually hitting the category training button and adjusting the term weight. So you can see from this list, words like sword and fate and lord are all very highly weighted. But if, for example, we decided that knight wasn't a relevant term, we could come along, reduce the weighting down, and next time a document gets processed, the word knight will count a lot less than the word queen. One very important thing to remember with auto classification is that the process is not magic. It takes a lot of time and care in selecting the initial seed records for your classification training, in adjusting your term weights. You need to have all of the feedback turned on so that you can see why records are being moved to particular places, and you can continue to adjust the training as you need to. But eventually, with some careful care, you should be able to get the process humming along nicely so that any documents that go into a holding area will be moved straight away to their correct place.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this demonstration.